Holy cow, everybody, it's a DEVIN TOWNSEND podcast. I've always hated podcasts, and here I am doing one now, because quarantine and all that. I've even got an intro. This one's about Ocean Machine. Yes. It's all a bunch of crap. All a bunch of crap. All right, so how do you do a podcast and not feel like a douche? I guess you just have to commit to feeling like a douche. I think a lot of times people do these things assuming that they're going to scale the summit of podcast famedom and become like Joe Rogan or something. And I am assuming that I will do a handful of these and get bored. So, in the meantime, enjoy. I don't know. So far, I feel like a douche. I guess I get to start by talking. How you guys holding out? Because this is crazy. I mean, I'm trying not to watch the news. I'm trying not to listen to the news. I'm trying to just kind of focus on my own life and on my own work and sort of try and contend with the omnipresent weirdness of all this, which I'm sure you can relate to. I find that if I'm not working, I just fall asleep. So I had done 2 solid weeks of work with the quarantine project, with all these songs and videos I was putting out each day, and I started finding myself getting really fatigued. Just the daily, it turned into a grind. What started off as being something that was really fun ended up being a lot of obligation that was put on myself by myself. So after a good solid 2 weeks of that, I decided just to take a couple of days off, and that's what I've done. But I find that I just fall asleep, and it's very easy just to sort of devolve into a depressive type of thinking as well. And I'm sure you can relate to that. And in Vancouver here, as I'm sure it is in many places in the world, it's just bizarre, where you do your weekly shopping run and you're all in a hazmat outfit, basically. And I'm trying to shop for the people around me who are older as well that can't or shouldn't be at least going out. But I mean, it's just bizarre. It's just totally bizarre. And if there's anything that I think it has cast light upon, it's the fact that when you're left to your own psychological devices that an environment like this quarantine imposes on you, I find it sheds light on certain parts of your psychology that maybe you have had too much noise in your life to really focus on. And for me, a lot of that comes down to how much of my identity is based on what I do. And in absence of that, who am I, really? And I think it's actually ultimately a very healthy thing to be confronted with at this stage in my career. And I guess that if I was to do a podcast, maybe starting from the beginning and going through each one of these records would be a way for me to maybe help myself on that psychological front as well. And maybe just sort of retroactively, I'd be able to get an idea of what these processes of making these records ultimately meant to me at the time and means to me now, specifically as my connection to music changes and the connection to how to do it professionally clearly changes with all the things that have happened. So let's talk about Ocean Machine. What's the best way for me to start? Ocean Machine was an incredibly difficult record for me to actualize. I guess the best place to start would be from the Steve Vai project. Prior to the Steve Vai project, I had a myriad of music that I was working on. In that included a lot of what became Heavy is a Really Heavy Thing by Strapping Young Lad, and as well, Ocean Machine. And when I got the Vai gig, it was on the back of being signed to Relativity Records on the strength of those demos, with a cassette that I had made called Noisescapes with a drummer buddy of mine. And when I had signed the deal to Relativity, I was very excited about being able to make a project that included all these emotional ups and downs in one place. The Ocean Machine and Strapping in one place. I had songs like Goat and Skin Me, but also I had Funeral and Death of Music and all these sort of songs that were sort of in one place. And fortunately for me, I got the Vi gig, which without that, I would have not been in the position that I'm in today. So that was fortuitous and meant a huge amount to me. But it also sort of sidelined that process of just really digging into what it was that the Ocean Machine record ended up becoming. I think a lot of my creative process involves figuring out what it isn't so I can know what it is. And to explain that further, I am a vision-based writer where I feel that I am chasing the feeling that I had at a time where there was a moment of emotional significance, whatever that might have been. It could have been birth of somebody or the death of somebody or some traumatic life experience or some exciting life experience. Any way you look at it, in those moments of emotional significance, there becomes imprinted on my creative psyche the desire to share that feeling with other people. And I guess one could ruminate on what that is rooted in. Maybe it's a need to be validated. Maybe it's a desire to help. Perhaps it's really as simple as I'm just terrified of the whole process of being alive. And so by having my creative works acknowledged by somebody else, it makes me feel less alone. Who knows? But Ocean Machine, I think the genesis of that started with the death of a friend of mine, Jesse Cadman, when I was about 17 years old. And although I don't feel I was emotionally mature enough during the course of the demo process of Ocean Machine, through that Steve Vai gig, and through all the experiences that I had with him and the touring and the ups and the downs and the kind of psychologically violent deflowering that came from moving to LA with stars in my eyes, assuming that the music industry was very clearly going to be all these things that I had seen on TV, and then recognizing that it wasn't. Through that experience, I think Ocean Machine turned into the album that it is. And I think that as much as I would have liked to have started my career with that conglomeration of music that was Strapping and Ocean Machine in the beginning, the rite of passage that the Steve Vai gig brought to me matured the Ocean Machine material into something that I think was of value. I think that prior to that, I had not had the life experience to really be able to reflect on my past and my emotional development or lack thereof to make an album that was significant to others. So I went through the Steve Vai experience, and we did the record Sex and Religion together. Came out on Relativity as well. That's how I met Steve, was the same A&R guy, Cliff Cultreri, who had signed my Noisescapes project, which is what it was called then, to Relativity. But I went through several years with Steve Vai and the making of that Sex and Religion album and living in Los Angeles and doing tours that were far beyond my expectations in terms of what I would do professionally. We did arena tours. We did a lot of really exciting type of live performance, The Tonight Show, and a tour of Japan that was very successful. But it was all with this sense that as awesome as that was, and as difficult as that was, I was doing it with my intentions and my sights solely set on eventually being able to do my own music. So when the Steve Vai touring cycle ended, I was thrilled to be able to go back to Vancouver and start to put together this album that I had put on hold. On the day that the Steve Vai gig ended, Cliff Cultreri, the A&R guy, flew out to Los Angeles for a meeting with me. And the meeting was at a Denny's, and it was very specifically for him to tell me that they, as a label, had been listening to the music that I had provided them, the songs that I had mentioned earlier, Funeral, Death of Music, Thing Beyond Things, Skin Me, Goat, The Filler. And they had decided collectively as a label that that output was too schizophrenic, quote unquote, to release. And so they had decided to drop the project. And I remember at the time, although I was profoundly disappointed, there was also this sense of, yeah, that seems about right. Learning about the music industry in the ways that I had over that past few years, this didn't seem out of line for the left turns that the music industry seemed to throw at people that I'd become more used to. So I left the Denny's in a daze, and the one thing that Cliff had said to close off the conversation, which was ultimately a godsend, was he said, listen, you've spent $60,000 making these demos. And if it was any other type of scenario with a typical record label, we would hold you accountable for that. But we're going to give you the rights to these masters. So, fortunately, I left that without a label deal, like a free agent at that point. Yet I had these elaborate demos that I had made for that Noisescapes record that then I could shop to others. So I went back to Vancouver, and after the Steve Vai gig, it was a very rude awakening. You spend all this time on tour and in tour buses and on TV and doing all these things, and you assume that your status as a performer and as a musician is of that level. And it took me a long time to realize that I was simply riding off the back of the work that Steve Vai had put into his career. And I needed, essentially, even with that experience, to start from scratch again. So I came back to Vancouver, and I had no money, and I had no prospects, and the record had been dropped. So I simply went out and got another job. And I started working doing dishes again at a restaurant in Vancouver. I remember the whole time just being apathetic and dazed by what had happened. And although those demos that I had were now in my possession, the mix quality and the erratic sonic nature of all these differing songs were such that it truly didn't make a concise listen. So I sent the projects out separately from that point. And I sent all the heavy stuff out to a number of labels, Roadrunner, Metal Blade, Censure Media, a bunch of labels. And then I sent The Ocean Machine separately with a different bio and a different promo pack, almost like they were two separate artists that were applying for a record deal. The first label that I heard back from was actually Roadrunner Records. And at that time, I had been profoundly influenced by a lot of what was going on with Roadrunner, with Fear Factory and Sepultura. As well, I was really interested in a lot of what Earache was doing with the Napalm Death stuff and Pitch Shifter and Meat Hook Seed, Godflesh. And when Roadrunner contacted me, they basically proposed a similar situation that Relativity had proposed in the beginning. And they asked to bring me out to New York and sort of give me the lowdown and the lay of the land when it came to Roadrunner. And they took me out for dinner, and I left that again with another contract. And I went home and started making demos, but yet again, the vibe between myself and the A&R there, who was Monty Connor, just started to shift. And I stopped hearing from him. So they gave me a couple of $1,000s to start mixing these demos, but then I couldn't get a hold of them anymore. And when I finally did get a hold of them, this was maybe 2 weeks of non-communication, Monty finally said, hey, listen, I know that we flew you out, and we know that we gave you this deal, and we know that we offered you this secondary album deal after you've been let go from Relativity, but the owner of Roadrunner Records, Case Wessels, heard your demo and truly hated it. He hated it in such a way that he refused to entertain the deal that had been offered to me by Monty. And I was, at this point, it was almost funny. I think if this had been a couple years earlier, I would have been devastated by that. But in this light, it became clear to me that this was just an aspect of this particular industry, the music industry, that I was going to have to get used to. The kind of ups and downs and the people saying that they would do something and then it turns to something else. And so I kind of just laughed that one off. And I remember, as a side note, Monty saying to me, listen, we know that this is disappointing to you, but we're looking for something different. And Case is looking for something that's more in line with the albums that are selling for us right now, which at that time was Typo Negative. And I said, well, fortunately, I've got this project that sounds exactly like Typo Negative. And he said, okay, well, send it to me, and maybe that will change his mind. And I said, of course. In fact, can I use your FedEx number so I can get it to you quickly? And he agreed. And so what I did was I used the FedEx tracking or account number to send a massive box, and all that was in the box was no cassette tape. It was just a picture of my asshole. It was me bending over and showing my asshole, and I had just signed it on the top to Monty, Case, and all the wonderful folks at Roadrunner, Devin. And so clearly that was it. Monty and I to this day remain friends because it wasn't ultimately his fault. It's just the nature of this industry. And a couple of weeks later, and keep in mind this is after hearing nothing from Ocean Machine, I heard from Century Media Records. And at that time I had joined the Wild Hearts and I was living in the UK. And I heard from Borovoy Kurgan, who is now the owner and main guy at blabbermouth.net. And he was the A&R guy for Century Media, which at that time was a brand new label, very, very small, very, very limited resources. And Bori, who's still to this day a great friend, cut to the chase in the ways that only Bori can. And he said, listen, nobody else wants this, so I'll give you $5,000 for it. And I remember thinking, well, no one else does want it. And in fact, I appreciate the honesty of that. After a couple of years now of people saying that they're going to deliver the moon and then it's just getting pulled out, having somebody say, no one else wants this, I'm vaguely interested in it, I'll give you enough money to mix it, was good enough for me. Now, during this time, I had sent out all these Ocean Machine packages and had heard nothing. Well, actually, as a correction, I heard from Mike Varney, who was the owner of Shrapnel Records, who in the 80s were famous for all the guitar shredders, the Yngwie Malmsteen, Tony McAlpine, Vinnie Moore, Paul Gilbert. He was the man for Shrapnel Records. And he had contacted me, and we had this strange kind of relationship where he would just kind of call up and talk. And I was maybe a little bit in awe because I grew up with the Shrapnel stuff. But when he finally said, listen, I heard your Ocean Machine material, and I think it's great. I would like to offer you a small deal for that. And this is at the same time as Century Media. However, he said, the stipulation is your song Bastard needs to be left off the record. And I said, well, why? He said, well, there's a line in there where you say, to all the hopeful ones, nobody gives a fuck what you've got. And the song is called Bastard. And I think he was of newly religious persuasion, and he took offense to those terms. And so I said, well, with all due respect, Mike, I'm going to say no to that deal. And I'm just going to focus on finishing the Strapping Young Lad album. And it was no disrespect to his beliefs or anything. The song Bastard was perfect to me the way that it was. So I carried on with Century Media, and I made Heavy is a Really Heavy Thing. But during that, which is a conversation for another time, I kept picking away at Ocean Machine. And I started believing that although there was not a lot of interest in the Ocean Machine project, I knew in my heart that it was a very good project. And I knew that the emotional components that make up Ocean Machine, specifically towards the latter half, where there's funeral into Bastard, into Death of Music, into Thing Beyond Things, that resonated so heavily with me in light of the experiences, these massive life-shifting experiences that I had had with Steve Vai, that I was convinced that if somebody was to give it an opportunity, a lot of people could relate to that sentiment and would enjoy it. So, in the background, I was working with Century Media on Strapping Young Lad, and I had sent one of these demos to the label in Japan who had put out Sex and Religion there to great effect. Sex and Religion had gone gold in Japan, and the A&R guy there, Naoki Takada, sent me a mail, no email at this point, and he said, listen, I think this record has a lot of potential. However, we're not in a position to sign you directly. So, as a friend, what I'm suggesting you do is you incorporate a name for a quote-unquote record label that you can then license this project to us. And we won't pay an advance up front, but because it's so close to being done and self-financed, we'll put it out as a license. And with the audience that you have played to in Japan, we're reasonably confident that this record could sell a few copies. So I continued to do that. I continued working on the Strapping Young Lad record. I continued working at the restaurant. I was doing a cartoon for a monthly magazine in Japan called Player Magazine that brought in a couple of $100 a month. And I just self-financed all of Ocean Machine and its recording and its mix. During this time, the first Strapping Young Lad record had come out. So although they started simultaneously, I couldn't get momentum for Ocean Machine. So the first Strapping Young Lad record came out. I did a couple of minor tours. And then I started writing City. And during the writing and recording of City, when I got together with Gene, Jed, and Byron for them to help me articulate that vision, I decided to use an engineer whom I'd worked with on a Stuck Mojo record called Pig Walk. And that engineer's name was Daniel Bergstrand. Daniel was Swedish, and he had basically been responsible for a lot of, at least, the sonic magnificence of what was at that time a very groundbreaking record by Meshuggah called Destroy, Erase, Improve. And I remember being so into his sounds that after working on the Stuck Mojo record together, I said, well, listen, I've got this record that I really feel strongly about, which was City. And because you're in America already, I'm going to be mixing this in Los Angeles. Would you come help me record that? And he did. And we mixed City together in Sweden, which is, again, a story for another time. And when Sony then had asked me to put together my own label and start to consider putting Ocean Machine out, I just called Daniel and I said, listen, the records that I've mixed thus far, which were Punky Brewster and the majority of Heavy is a Really Heavy Thing, just don't sound good enough. I have the ideas, I just don't have the technical skills to make it sound as good as you did with City. So if you don't mind helping me mix Ocean Machine, I would really appreciate it. And please keep in mind I don't have a lot of money at this point either. So Daniel said, well, I'm into it. However, the only stipulation is you're going to have to come to Spain to mix it. And having gone to Sweden for the first one, for City, it was not, in my mind at least, it was not that far away from the experience that I would have had in Stockholm. or Uppsala, actually. But by the time I had committed to it and gotten to the studio in Malaga, Spain, to mix this record with Daniel, it was clear to me that this was an entirely different situation. I guess the best way to start talking about the technical sides of this record would be the personnel and the recording of the Ocean Machine record. So I've always been fascinated with the idea of putting together what is ultimately a band from the outsider's perspective. Although in the beginning and for the most part of my career, I've written 90 to 100% of all these records. And although that was the case, something probably about the Steve Vai project made me very hesitant to draw the attention back to myself, to say, this is Devin Townsend, Ocean Machine. This is Devin Townsend, Heavy is a Really Heavy Thing. For whatever reason, I was enamored by the idea of each one of these projects having an identity that could have a logo, could have a vibe, a color, a group of people, a promo shot that had a bunch of interesting looking characters in it. So, although I continued to write all the music, I chose, by the time City was ready to be recorded, in the last 2 weeks I had Gene involved, I had Jed involved, I had Byron involved, with music that was already written. And the same thing happened with Ocean Machine. By the time it was ready to record, I was looking for people to put together something that in my mind's eye looked like a cool band and was a quote-unquote band. So a good friend of mine who, if you've watched the Live in Plovdiv Ocean Machine DVD that came out a couple of years ago, you would see a guy that was sitting in the Ocean Machine part. And his name is Squid, or John Harder. And he was a really close friend of mine, and is a very close friend of mine. And during the writing of the Ocean Machine material, him and I hung out a lot and had a bunch of crazy experiences. And during one of those experiences, I remember thinking, Squid, it would be great if you could be involved with the Ocean Machine idea. You seem to resonate with this whole vibe. You seem to understand my objectives of making mid-tempo heavy rock that's in line with what Metallica had been doing with the Black Album, but with a cross between that and Enya or Def Leppard or King's X, or something that's a lot more sort of spaced out than the Metallica stuff. If I was to draw a comparison between Ocean Machine and the Metallica album, if the Metallica album was the Black Album, Ocean Machine, in my mind, has always been the Blue Album. So Squid agreed, and he said, well, not only that, but I've got a drummer in mind who I've worked with, who I'm looking for an opportunity to involve with something again because I think he's so great. And his name was Marty Chapman. Marty lived in Winnipeg on the other side of Canada at this time, but I took Squid's recommendation and his advice, and I flew Marty and his drum kit to Vancouver, sight unseen, so we could rehearse together and I could teach them both the material that at that point already existed. So Marty flew out. I got into a jam spot in Vancouver called the Vancouver Rock Space, and I had all the material demoed out, and I gave it to all of these players. Well, I guess both of these players, Marty and Squid, and I asked them to learn it verbatim. And then we got to the rehearsal space and we went through it for maybe a week and a half. And as a side note, a funny thing that happened during that experience was attached to the Vancouver Rock Space was a studio called The Factory, which is ultimately where I ended up recording all of the Devin Townsend project, those 4 releases, as well as a lot of the Noisescapes material. Prior to The Factory, it was Little Mountain Sound, and that was an iconic Vancouver studio. And in that studio, at the same time as we were rehearsing, was Rob Halford doing his 2 album. And I remember very distinctly rehearsing this Ocean Machine material, the door opening, and Rob Halford walking in and just sitting and watching us play. I think he was always and has been and continues to be very supportive of young up-and-coming bands. And just sight unseen, he came in and watched us play. And I was so stunned by that, because as a teen, I was so enamored by Judas Priest and all of that it just seemed so surreal to me. And it ended up being an interesting meeting. He invited the band, myself, Marty, and Squid over, and he played his new songs, and then he ended up spending time with Marty and Squid, and it was very interesting. So we did the rehearsals, and I decided, not in any small part to do with that experience seeing Rob Halford's work happening at the Factory Studios, to record the basic tracks of Ocean Machine there as well. So we basically just packed up the gear, moved it next door. I took a week of recording time with Sheldon Zaraco, who is the engineer with Addicted, Key, Deconstruction, Ghost, and the owner of the Factory Studio at that time, whose name was John McLean. And we decided to track guitars, bass, and drums at the factory. And when we plugged in, I remember I had this very distinct sound I wanted for the drums. I wanted that Black Album Metallica attack. I wanted that type of guitar sound. I wanted that type of fidelity that went from such a broad range of low frequencies to high frequencies, because you have to remember at that time, that Metallica record was very much state of the art in terms of the sonic qualities and how it reacted to the radio compression. So I felt that by doing it in a similar studio, or the same studio as Metallica had worked in for a certain amount of time on that album, and just with a certain type of tuning on the drums and a certain type of amps and everything, I would be able to clearly achieve that goal. However, upon starting that recording, it became clear to me immediately that the sounds that I was going for, we were achieving things that were drastically different. It has taken me many years to recognize how much the studio trickery and the vision that the engineer and mixer has goes into the sound of these final records, including the mastering and all the elements of it. I figured that if it was the same studio, similar tuning, then it would be a piece of cake, but it wasn't. So we struggled the whole time recording. I remember we couldn't get a bass sound that was good. I disliked the guitar sound that we got. The drums, although the performances were there, the overheads didn't capture a lot of the nuance. And I remember each day coming back to the studio, and I had taken time off from the restaurant, and my wife at the time was going to school, and we were broke. And I remember thinking just defeatist thoughts every day once we finished. I remember thinking, it's just not right. It's just not right. After all this time, it's just not right. So fast forwarding again to going to Spain, I brought these basic tracks to Daniel, and I remember him hearing them and going, oh, these aren't going to work. We're going to have to do a lot of sampling with the drums. We're going to have to reamp the bass guitar with the DI. And because the guitars were recorded without a DI, they were practically useless for trying to achieve that vibe I was trying to achieve. So when I went to Spain, I also freighted with me the amplifier that I had borrowed for the sessions that ultimately ended up becoming City. The amplifier was located in Los Angeles, and it was a friend of mine's amplifier, and it was made by an amp builder named Morin. I think his name was Mike Morin. And the amp that he had made, that my friend Marty owned, was a one-off. And it was a sound that no one really grooved on. It was basically a converted Laney head. And it was very compressed. But Daniel was able to coax out of that head a sound that was really good for City. And so I was convinced that that was the only amplifier we could use to get a good sound for Ocean Machine. So I had it freighted to Spain. And I remember when it landed, because we had sent it just economy, it had been beat up. And all the tubes were smashed, and the transformer was bent. and it just ultimately wasn't working. So the Spanish studio just became one problem after another. And I will always remember that experience as being one of the most profoundly negative studio experiences I've ever involved myself in. Why was it negative? Well, many things. The owner of the studio and I just did not get along. The vibe of the studio was just so not conducive to a relaxed workspace. It was in the back of a massive warehouse that basically rented PA equipment, and it was just brightly lit tile. Everything was white. It was DA 88s, which were a step above ADATs, which, for those of you who remember, were basically a digital form of recording medium that used super VHS tapes or high-definition recording cartridges to record on. And although they were a step above, a 4-track cassette recorder, they had a lot of limitations, specifically sonically. There was a EQ spike, this digital hardness to those things that were just unavoidable. And I did a lot of those early records on it. City, Ocean Machine, a lot of these things were done on DA88 or ADAT. But suffice to say, the studio was just a terrible vibe to try and actualize this Ocean Machine material. And every day I remember fighting with the studio owner because he had this group of friends that at a moment's notice, he would just cancel the sessions that we had booked, because I was only there for 10 days, and then just bring his friends in. They just get hammered and sing songs and record each other all night. And I had no real say over it. I had no contract with him. I was emotionally not particularly mature at that time, so I could not find the ways to articulate my discontent in a way that would be not only democratic in terms of everybody else that was involved with it, but also just reasonable. So I just had an extensively terrible time trying to deal with that guy, his studio, and the fact that once we did get in there, things would break randomly. Things would just fall apart. So through trial and error and storms and siestas and financial things that were going left, right, and center, I was staying with Daniel at his house and neither of us had money. We managed to get that album mixed. And Daniel, I will always credit for being able to save that record. We retracked the drums. We solved the problems with the lack of detail of the cymbals by overdubbing cymbals. And he was very meticulous with where I hit them and miking them up. And then even with the snare, because I wanted that Metallica sound, we just actually put on the Metallica Black Album and took a audio sample of one of the snares in the beginning of the song Sad But True, where it goes dun 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 dun, and I just took that dun 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 dun. I took one of those snares and we used that underneath the analog sound of Marty's snare drum, and we achieved a sound that I thought was acceptable. So whenever you listen to the Ocean Machine record, every snare hit has one of those Metallica samples on it. And by the end of it, the studio, the vibe between myself and the studio owner kept progressing from bad to worse until finally at the end, I was not willing to pay him what he demanded I pay him for the time. I thought that I had been given a terrible deal, and so I refused. And he said, okay, well, you're not getting your tapes. So Daniel and I snuck into the studio at 3 a.m, did a copy of the master tapes, and then I left the next morning. And so all of that Ocean Machine mix happened as a result of me and Daniel just trying to problem solve a terrible situation. Upon getting home, I remember hearing the mixes and thinking, as great as a job we did, there were certain things about it that were just still off-putting to me. I couldn't figure out a way, for example, to organize the songs so that by the time the record was finished, the audience was left with the emotional experience that I had upon realizing so many years ago what it was that I was trying to put across. And through the Steve Vai experience and through the death of my friend and through all these experiences, it became clear that unless this record was organized and the running order was in a way that was emotionally carrying out this trajectory that I was subconsciously trying to follow. Again, it's about taking things away that are wrong before I recognize what is right. It was just not going to work. So I kept trying different sequences. So at first, it was just going to be the songs that I had done in Spain. Incidentally, there was one song in Spain that I forgot to get the master tape of. We did a version of the song Ocean Machines with the same sound quality as the actual album, but it got left in Spain. So I've never even heard it. The chances of it existing somewhere now are very slim. But when I got back, I remember putting it in different orders and thinking, it's good, but it doesn't leave me with that sentiment, that chaotic, how do you summarize not only your adolescence, but this massive paradigm shift in your own consciousness that had occurred during this period. So it was actually Squid at that point who said, well, you should really include some of these demos that you've done. So it's not just that album. And the demos included Thing Beyond Things, The Death of Music, and certain transitions like into Voices in the Fan and things like this. And upon doing that, I recognized that even though the sound quality wasn't consistent with the songs that we had done in Spain, what it put across to me as a participant in this musical experience was a summary of that entire decade of my life that led up to that. And so I remember at the end, finally getting a bit more money so I could master it, finally getting a bit more money so I could assemble it, finally getting a bit more money so I could do artwork for it. I remember delivering it to Sony and thinking, this is great. I really think that this album is something that could go over well. But again, it came out, and although it did reasonably well in Japan, I couldn't get a bite anywhere. So I started, while touring with Strapping Young Lad on the City album and working on other things that I was trying to do at that point to avoid having to continue working at the restaurant, I kept sending this out. I would send it back to Roadrunner. I'd send it to Century Media. I'd send the final album is what I was sending these people, the thing that you hear today. Yet no one that I knew at that time seemed to see the potential in it. And there were only two people that did. There was a lady who was the editor of Metal Hammer in England at that time. Her name is Robin Dorian. And she gave the album full marks as an independent release in the Metal Hammer magazine and said, this album is fantastic. And through that, a small independent label in Germany called USG signed me for just Ocean Machine and brought me over for a press release. However, as these things go, USG immediately went bankrupt prior to the record coming out. So it was like start, stop, start, stop, start, stop. But by this time, on the strength of the fact that I had created this independent label in Heavy Devi Records, on the advice of Sony Records, I then owned all the rights to Ocean Machine. So I figured that I would just start to release these things independently. And I signed on to further albums with Century Media Records for the strapping stuff, but with one stipulation, and that stipulation was they only have the rights to Strapping Young Lad. I put into the contract, which at that time they seemed to think was a non-issue, because why would they worry about that? I put into the contract that they only have rights to Strapping Young Lad, and I have the ability to release anything else that I want on my own, aside from Strapping Young Lad. And they agreed to that. I continued working with Strapping Young Lad, and I ultimately ended up doing 5 records with them, DVD as well. And I continued selling Ocean Machine independently through a website, through a mail order, through a fan club, and it did okay. And then the more I started traveling with Strapping, and the more I started gaining momentum and a reputation as a working musician, the more the ideas for the follow-up record, Infinity, began to take shape. And then before I knew it, I had a number of records out. Ocean Machine, Infinity, Terria, Physicist. Well, actually, it was Ocean Machine Infinity first, at which point the label Inside Out Records took the reins from USG, and Thomas Waber, who is still the owner of the record label whom I work with, this is 20 years ago, said, I'll give you an advance for each one of these titles if you license to only Inside Out for your solo music. So at that point, I had 2 deals. I had a record deal for Strapping, and I had an independent license deal for all my solo material with Inside Out. This whole sequence of events ultimately was the best possible scenario for me. I was able to quit my job at the restaurants. I was able to begin touring, and I was able to function as a professional musician as a result of having both of these sides of my creative identity exist simultaneously. Which, when I think back to Relativity Records, when I think back to the complaints that were levied at this material after Steve Vai of it being too schizophrenic, it seemed almost like poetic justice that the thing that disallowed me from putting that record out on Relativity ended up being the very thing that allowed me to function professionally in the ways that I continue to now. So that was ultimately the best possible scenario. Ocean Machine was and is a pivotal record for me. It basically defined my role in the music industry as being somebody who is able to take artistic chances without too much repercussions. To this day, I feel like I am able to do whatever I feel compelled to do as a result of the confidence that I gained from this entire period of my life that at the time I couldn't see the forest for trees. I thought it was just bad news after bad news after bad news. So I think that's also very important moving forward for me as an artist to keep in mind, that you can never be too sure that some of the things that you're suffering at the moment aren't the very things that will end up being to your benefit in the future. So now what I'm going to do is I am looking at the Wikipedia page for Ocean Machine. I had asked online for you to give me questions about this album, and I ended up doing an entire podcast, if you want to call it that, on Ocean Machine prior to doing this one here. But I realized that the act of doing a podcast requires more presence of mind than I had realized. So I'm going to do this again. And I apologize for these not being your questions, but I think by going through this Wikipedia page, I should be able to give a basic oversight on anything that you would have asked, or at least I hope so. So when I look at the personnel on this record, J.R. Harder, bass, Squid, Marty Chapman, who was a fantastic drummer and who is unfortunately passed. He took his own life about 9 years ago, which was a tragedy, of course. But I look back at his work and I can take solace in the fact that I remember him as being one of the most fantastic drummers I've ever worked with. We didn't have to edit a single thing. Those are all just him playing. He was right in the pocket. He had this incredible strength, and he had a focus about him that allowed him to track in a way that I've just never participated in. Chris Val did some backing vocals. Chris sang on He was the singer for Zimmer's Hole, and he sang with me on Strapping Stuff. Val, we call him. He dressed like a devil and peed vodka out of a prosthetic cock in Zimmer's Hole. John Morgan was keyboard, samples, and engineering. John also played keyboards for a little while in Strapping Young Lad, and I had worked with him on his band called Unit 187. Matteo Caratazzolo was my studio cohort. I did so much recording, not only for Ocean Machine, but for Infinity, City, Heavy is a really heavy thing, Physicist, at a studio called Red Stripe Studios. And Matteo was the studio gnome, we used to call him. He just lived at the studio, and he was an excellent friend of mine. Just a fantastic person to be cooped up in a studio with. And I credit him for a lot of those late night conversations that allowed me to kind of sort through the emotional baggage that needed to be sorted through in order to articulate Ocean Machine correctly. Tim Oberthier was the engineer at Slack Studios, which is a tiny little studio owned by, what's the name of that record label from Vancouver? They put out a bunch of, they put out Sarah McLachlan, and I forget. I'll remember at some point, I'm sure. But anyway, Tim was hired by that record label, and they had a tiny little ADAT studio that was very cheap, maybe $100 a day. And so I recorded the vocals for Ocean Machine there. Sheldon Zaharko engineered it, and again, that was one of his first engineering gigs, and it was the first time I ever worked with him. And to this day, Sheldon and I are still good friends. He co-mixed Dark Matters with me. He was the engineer for Key, Addicted, Deconstruction, and Ghost. Daniel Bergstrand did the mixing with me. He had also done Meshuggah, Strapping Young Lad, a ton of things. He was just the best at that time, in my opinion. Victor Morden was a Spanish engineer who worked at the studio in Malaga, who, in opposition to the owner of the studio, whom I thought was just a gigantic cock, Victor was great. And he really was aware of the trying nature of that relationship, and not only translated daily these arguments that I had with the owner, but also was a great person to work with. Masa Noda did artwork. He actually did the photography. Masa is a Japanese photographer whom I had met years ago during the Heavy is a Really Heavy Thing promo tour I had done in Japan. And I flew him to Vancouver because I thought that he could really capture what it was I was looking for. He actually went through on the same photo shoot that we had done for Ocean Machine, all the photos on the inside of the City album, all the downtown Japan, all the downtown Japanese photography was just him. So I felt it was important for me to include him in that as well. Daniel Collins did the photos for me, and he was a local photographer who had done a bunch of photos for me before. And the artist's name was Scully, and I actually don't even remember his real name, but he unfortunately passed away too. But he also did the City artwork. So as I look through the Ocean Machine Wikipedia here, I see that there is the track listing. So let's look at this. First song in the album, Seventh Wave. All right, so what can I say about Seventh Wave? Well, when I was a kid, we used to go on vacation to the Oregon coast and spend a lot of time at the ocean. And when you're young and you're playing by the ocean, there's always this fear, I'm assuming, from your parents that if you turn your back on the ocean, a wave will come in and take you. And on several occasions, actually, I remember being close to the ocean and just being hammered by a larger than usual wave. One time in particular, I remember my father having to come into the ocean and take my sister and I when we were sort of floating out. And one of the, I don't know if it was a wives' tale or if it was a myth, but the idea of the seventh wave is that every seventh wave that crests onto the shore carries an extra type of momentum that if you're not paying attention to can sneak up on you. They're actually known as sneaker waves as well. In fact, I've just looked it up, and it says here on the internet, which is always right, as we both know, that the seventh wave in many parts of the world, local folklore predicts that out of a certain number of waves, one will be much larger than the rest. Every seventh wave or every ninth wave are examples of such common beliefs that have wide circulation and have entered popular culture through music, literature, and art. So I think that Ocean Machine as an album ultimately represented a loss of innocence. And I think because it had begun during adolescence, the writing of the songs, that included Thing Beyond Things, Death of Music, they were all sort of in line with that process of becoming a child to an adult. And perhaps on some subconscious level, I thought that the idea of a seventh wave, something that was sneaking up on you, was perhaps that onset of adulthood. The idea of perhaps taking the red pill as opposed to the blue pill, if you're going to be using matrixy analogies, which I highly recommend that you don't. All right. Life, second song. So this song was actually written during the period that I had already booked the studio to start tracking drums. I remember going to a pub in Vancouver, which I think is still open, called the Rose and Thorn, and getting myself a beer and just sitting down and writing my lyrics out. What I tend to do when I'm in the midst of the composition of an album is I'll purchase a blank notebook and carry it with me and just continuously scroll down thoughts. And then that inevitably becomes my lyric book. And whilst sitting there drinking the beer and having a moment at this pub, a song by Space Hog came on. And it was the popular one at the time. I forget the name of it. But it structurally was appealing to me. So Life became influenced by that Space Hog song. And I think the idea with Life on this album was to keep amidst the negativity, or maybe not the negativity, but the melancholy that is Ocean Machine. The melancholy that certainly resonates with loss of innocence and the realization that things were not as you thought they would be, such as Los Angeles when I moved down there and anticipated the music industry as being this glorious creative mecca that I had assumed it would be, and then realizing it's an industry that is loaded with a lot of negativity and a lot of corruption, like any industry, really. I wanted to make sure that while representing that transition and representing it through that sense of melancholy, there was at least a moment of lightness on it. And Life was meant to be a manifestation of that. It was meant to be a proclamation that although there had been death and a lot of deflowering that had gone on in this period, it was not all lost. And I think, if I'm being honest about my canon of work, if I look through Strapping Young Lad, if I look through any of these albums, that theme is omnipresent in the work. Even when things get to their most dark, there's still consciously an aspect of hope that has been added to these records. Even if I look at the album Alien, which was a profoundly negative album, there was a song like 2 Weeks on there. There was a song like Stagnant on Terria, or Christine on Infinity. And oftentimes there's been an assumption that when I'm writing these songs, that I'm trying to, quote unquote, break into the mainstream by writing a commercial song. But not only was that not my intention, but it was never pursued on any of these albums that we would try and take one of these more commercially slanted songs and try and propose it to mainstream radio. My desire to write songs like Life, Christine, Stagnant, the last song on Accelerated Evolution, Slow Me Down, any number of those songs is rooted in my appreciation for that type of music, for the structure of that type of music, and for the idea of trying to make a concise statement about these sorts of things. And Life was the Ocean Machine equivalent of that mechanism. So the next song is Night. And Night was written during the same period of time in which I was writing the material for City. And at that time, what had fallen into my orbit in terms of my listening at that point was an album by The Cure. And I had not spent a lot of time with The Cure as a band and haven't since then. But the album was called Wish. And the first song, Open, was massively inspiring to me at that time. I think a combination during that Ocean Machine period of that album, Killjoy by She Had, Only Heaven by the Young Gods, and then the things that were influencing strapping at that point as well, like Morbid Angel and Old Lady Drivers and certain albums of that ilk. But that Cure song, Open, they had a sort of bent halftone thing that became the driving influence for Night. And while I was listening to that Cure album, I was driving and it was raining, and there was a sense of momentum to that drive and that participation with that particular Cure album that really influenced Night. And from there, I went to Japan, and there was a real sense of longing that went along with this period between me and my connection to Japan. I think because the Steve Vai record had gone so well there and the tour had been so successful there, I falsely attributed a sense of like that was my home. Like that was my goal, was to get back to Japan. And Night was a song about that longing, I suppose, because at that point I was back in Vancouver and I was working a job again, and my relationship was troubled, and there was a lot of just practical life things that were going on that were fraught with difficulty. And I think that After Life on Ocean Machine is where it starts to dig more into the reality of those past 10 years. The next song, Hide Nowhere, there was, in line with the fantasy that I felt was equated to Japan and a lot of other things that were like an escapist type of thinking during this period. One other escapist type of thinking for me was the idea of that I wasn't from the earth, that on some level I was in the wrong place and I was actually from outer space or what have you. And it was interesting because it took having kids and it took participating in the passing of loved ones and birth and a lot of the reality that came out of making some personal and public mistakes that allowed me to recognize that that whole fantasy about thinking that I didn't belong here was just that. And Hide Nowhere, as well as Voices in the Fan and Greetings, were very much in line with that fantasy. I was so discouraged by the music industry and my experiences in it that I just wanted to escape. That seemed to be my whole objective during City, during Ocean Machine. And very likely that's why I found drugs and alcohol so enticing at that point, because it gave me a place that I could pretend was real, because it seemed to provide me with some sort of creative momentum at the time, but was so far removed from the problems that it was an avoidance. And I felt at that time that I was pursuing something that was very real to me through all these types of escape. And it took the creation of Ocean Machine City, and then Infinity and Terria and Physicist, and it took that trajectory of music for me to recognize that that was what it was. It was an escape from a reality that I didn't want to face. I didn't want to face that I am who I am, and all the awkwardness and the quirks and the foibles and all these things about my personality, that in order to become confident in who I am and what it is that I want to achieve at this stage of my life, I needed to accept. And at that point, I was actively avoiding all the things about me. When I think back to the trajectory of all these albums, one thing that is exceptionally clear to me now is that probably as a result of an upbringing that, although loving, was also rooted in a generation that actively discouraged overt displays of emotion. I think I was born to be a very sensitive and creative entity. But if you are actively encouraged to not display that and to hold that in, the stiff upper lip kind of, I don't know, my British heritage, I suppose. My grandparents were from Britain, and my other side was from Ireland, and they were rooted in a sort of stoic denial of those real heavy emotions, or any emotions really that were overt, like anger or love or anything. And not to say that my family was stunted in that way, it was just not actively encouraged. But because from a very young age I felt the need to express that, and was met with the idea that to do so was uncouth, I think had I not found the socially acceptable outlet of being able to portray that through music, it would have resulted in some real, it would have resulted in more ulcers than I probably already have. So all these albums have become, on a practical level, a way for me to sort through the emotional things that I think as a young person I never truly learned how to deal with or to express. And so when I look back at the lineage of these records, one goes into the other in a very linear way. Ocean Machine was about, a season change, about dealing with the idea of death, about taking the idea of change and loss of innocence. And then from there was an anger, a very palpable anger that resulted in City. And then from both of those records, there was a real need, or a perceived need, to escape. And that resulted in Infinity. And then from Infinity, there became very clear to me that I had made vast personal and professional mistakes based on a combination of situations that were rooted in naivety, insecurity, and arrogance. And then from there, Physicist became an apology. And then Terria became an acceptance. And onward and onward and onward. So when I look at Hide Nowhere, that song was very much rooted in the idea that these issues, these personal mistakes or personal fears, I was personifying as either demons or aliens, and I couldn't hide from them. There was a real sense that these feelings that I had been suppressing for all my life up to that point were very much now ready to surface. And during the course of the Ocean Machine record, although I was able to emotionally articulate what it was that was coming through, I wasn't emotionally able to understand until many years later. Sister, I think when I think about the relationship that I have with my sister, and when I think about the relationship I have with my family, it's unbearably loving. Yet, I think if you're raised in a way where you are not able to understand how to express that to each other, it becomes this silent kind of dialogue between you that is best expressed with an acknowledgement of that awkwardness. And sister, I think, is a manifestation of that expression. There's nothing I can say. And what is it that you're trying to say? You're trying to say, I love you. But it's a hard thing to say as well, specifically when those types of overt emotional displays are often met with an uncomfortable reaction. 3 a.m. So this song, I think, has a lot to do with the idea of the witching hour. The idea that there was a Roald Dahl book I read as a child. And I forget which one it was, but it started with the idea that there was this witching hour where everybody in the world at that point, I guess, on that in that book, was asleep. And if you wake up during that period, you're privy to information or experiences that you are maybe not supposed to be privy to. And although that is fiction, clearly, that is also very much in line with the idea, the overarching idea of Ocean Machine representing a loss of innocence. The idea that you are privy to something that you shouldn't be, that there's something underneath the waves. And that's ultimately what that song on the City album was about as well. I remember being at college and thinking that there was some sort of structure to the college that we were at, and then overhearing the owners of the college discussing financial problems and the ramifications of those things. And there was a real sense of emptiness that came from the awareness that there is no ceiling to this, that there is no control, that ultimately the decisions that one makes in one's life, you are accountable for. And you are your own, for lack of better word, I can't even think of a word that doesn't spark some sort of religious imagery, which is not what I'm trying to achieve here. You're your own master. And in order to accept that, you also have to accept not only the good things that happen to you, but also the randomness of it all. And the lack of structure, the ultimate chaos in which, in order to find any sense of mental peace, you have to surrender to, or else it'll make you crazy, specifically as someone who feels the need to control their environment. So 3 a.m. was meant to represent waking up at that time in awareness of the fact that things had changed and that you are now participating in something that is profoundly strange. And that strangeness, again, ultimately I realized later was not strange, but just raw. Voices in the Fan followed it. Now, the idea with the voices in the fan, I used to have a friend who, and I still do have a friend, who dislikes intently listening to any looped sound. Like, I would work on a loop, like anything, like a tape loop or an echo loop. And I always loved the idea of those echoes and those loops spinning and spinning and spinning until in it you start hearing things like information. And I'm not talking about voices, I'm just talking about musical information, or you're starting to pick things out of that loop that you didn't hear in the beginning. There's something hypnotic about that. And this friend of mine would actively avoid listening to a fan because they would say that they would hear over time voices emerging from that repetitive whir of the fan. Now, that's something that I haven't personally participated in, but I liked the idea that there was a different realm in which all these energies and all these entities exist that coincides with the realm in which we live. And I liked the idea, in a fictional sense, that a way to access that was to listen to the voices in the fan. And in line with my need to escape, or my desire to escape, rather, during this ocean machine time, I kept pining for aliens to come take me away from this reality that I felt myself in, that I was just so angry at, dissatisfied with, frustrated by. So, in a fantasy sense, I used to pine that in the middle of the night, you'd wake up at 3 a.m. and you'd be abducted into a beautiful realm where there was not the chaos and the confrontation and the war and the destruction and the physical reality and how that manifests as suffering. And then the idea with Voices in the Fan was the lyrics were meant to be for your loved ones as a leaving note. So, tonight they come for me. Please help the others understand I've become the voices in the fan. So if you ever want to access that connection, just listen to that whir, and that's where I'll be. That was the idea behind that song. Greetings, again, was perhaps now that you have been taken away. And when I used the term aliens or abduction, it wasn't necessarily that. It was more the idea of just an escape from the relentless ugliness of the life that I perceived to have after the come down from the experience that I had with Steve Vai. And was it ugly, truly? Well, I mean, not in comparison to the suffering that many, many people, even in North America, have. But perhaps there's also, during this period, the transition from being admittedly maybe a coddled child to having to contend with real life and my lack of desire to do so. So Greetings was meant to be perhaps, and I'm just ruminating here, on a fictional level, also from the point of view of now that you are gone, now you're in a different world, now you're in a beautiful realm where everything is crystalline and with an absence of suffering. From my world, I bring you greetings. And the idea that during these lyrics, the idea that if an altruistic and beautiful race were to reach the earth, what would their perception of the human species be? And this is no better time to be referenced than now when I look at how profoundly frightened as a species we are, and how we react to opinions different than our own, and how we react to ideologies different than our own. The idea that we are so resistant to ideas that challenge our beliefs for whatever reason. Perhaps we just have so much invested in those beliefs because we are under the surface fundamentally aware that this is a chaotic environment that we do have no control over. That the one way that we can assume we have some sense of control is to cling to our ideologies and our beliefs with such ferocity that if they're ever challenged, it's just, this means war. And the idea with greetings was just that. I believe we'll lose our world for them. I believe we'd throw up arms before them and bore them. That was the idea. It's escapism. The whole Ocean Machine was me trying to be away from myself. And hence the artwork as well. When I look at the artwork, it's just a blue expanse. And although there is the head on the cover, it was originally, if I had my druthers, it was just meant to be water with nothing else. No lyrics, no text, nothing. Just the blue. And as a side note, the album was called, and is called now, Ocean Machine, Biomech. But it came out under several different names. It came out under Devin Townsend, Ocean Machine, Biomech. I think if I'm looking back at this and I'm asked to make a assessment on why that happened, I believe that in line with the trajectory that these albums have taken over these years, one of the things that I have needed to learn was the self-confidence to put music out under my own name. I felt like maybe I wasn't worthy of that attention, or I didn't want to adhere my name to music because my connection to music makes me feel like as an artist, our role is to just listen and document it rather than taking credit for writing it. Whatever the reasons were, it was difficult for me up till recently to just put my name onto these albums. But Greetings was essentially the final sort of alien song, the final escape song on Ocean Machine. But then it starts to get back to reality. And not only reality, it's the other side. Because when I look at the beginning, the seventh wave is the oncoming storm. And life is the holding on to the idea of the positivity throughout it, but then consciously diving into it. Regulator, the idea of a regulator was, I guess, directly related to the scuba diving regulator, the apparatus you put on your face to breathe underwater. But I've often felt in my own life that the idea of a regulator on an emotional level for me has been something that has always been there. So for example, if I went to a party, if I went down a road in my personal life that was toxic, or if I ended up choosing to try something that I knew was bad for me on a personal level, on a psychological level, in terms of what I put into my body, media, whatever, there's always been this internal sense of knowing when I've crossed the line. And how that often manifested is I would just vomit. I remember thinking to myself, I'm going to do this thing. And I won't say what these things were, just to try and keep a semblance of a private life. I remember thinking, I'm going to do this. And I know that it's not the right thing to do, but I need to know what will happen to me when I do it. And that has been my methodology throughout my entire career and life. I need to touch it to know how I feel about it. So whatever that may be, I was vegetarian for many years, and then I went back to eating meat just so I could see what it was doing to me, why I was doing it, and then I could make an informed decision past that point, and then stay away from it, or whatever the situation was. And I would do that with everything. I would do that with drugs. I would do that with sex. I would do that with music. I would do that with people. I would do that with certain types of thinking. And what typically happened is I would get past the point where I knew I should be, and I would react, and still do, physically in a violent way. I remember I would do these things, and I would pull over onto the side of the road and just vomit. And so there was always this sense of an internal regulation for me of knowing when I've gone past. And that, I think now, at this stage of my life, I could view more as intuition rather than anything supernatural or anything beyond me. I think that honing intuition a lot of times requires getting to know yourself, specifically throughout all those ugly crevices in your personality that perhaps at one time in one's life you could assume was beyond you. I remember thinking that my desire and my ability to articulate very toxic art was rooted in some sort of possession, some sort of demonic thing in my own personality, rather than a part of my personality that had been traumatized as a young child or an adolescent, that then I suppressed to the point where, as a result of not consciously dealing with it, as a result of not consciously looking at it, what ends up happening is it manifests as a shadow within me, and then I fear it. And that regulation that that song Regulator sings about, I think, in hindsight, is intuition. And again, as a side note, the first album that I have integrated this part of my personality as being something that I have compassion for rather than fear of was Empath, which is the reason why songs like Hear Me and Singularity and the heavy parts of Genesis, that's why it's all together in one place. Because as opposed to viewing that part of my personality as an aberration, I'm viewing it now as a part of me that is a child that needs to be heard and to have compassion for, so that it can heal itself. Funeral. So after this trajectory on Ocean Machine of wanting to go away, I can't hide from this, just take me away. It's 3 a.m, please take me away. I'm gone. I'm the voices in the fan. I'm high. I'm drunk. You know, whatever it is, I'm escaping. Funeral is a very pragmatic and grounding element of Ocean Machine, and one that firmly slams the protagonist back down to earth. Funeral deals again with the death of my friend Jesse Cadman when I was a child, and it was the first time I had participated in death. It was the first time I went to a funeral that had an open casket. It was the first time I saw somebody whom I cared for who was no longer in his body. And I remember the feeling was such profound confusion and terror to view a human body as being separate from the identity that I had attributed to this personality that I knew. And that confusion chased me throughout the Steve Vai experience, throughout the Wild Hearts experience, throughout the Strapping Young Lad experience. And the song Funeral was a very primal release of that energy. And I think if I look at the loss of innocence that I keep saying Ocean Machine is meant to represent. Perhaps fundamentally, although there were a lot of different components to that same trajectory during this period, the idea of the loss of a loved one was ultimately the catalyst that propelled Ocean Machine into being. And Funeral was not only the song that represented that particular passing, but it also represents a very deliberate turning point on the record, where it goes from being, this is a fantasy, I'm not from here, I've been taken away at night, to, no man, this is real. This is something that is black and white. So Bastard, the song that follows it, was very much about depression, very much about the mourning of that, the acceptance of the fact that not only are you not an alien, not only are you not fundamentally different from other people, but you have some real, legitimate, tangible problems that in order for you to move on, you're going to need to face. And facing those things is typically why escape becomes so enticing to people. Because escaping to a world of fantasy seems so much more alluring than having to look at death in the face, to look at your own failings in the face, to look at your own personality and how that is manifested as problems in your life, as something that is up to you to solve. So Bastard is the glum recognition of that, the feelings of isolation. And I remember during one of the experiences that I had during this period where I was trying to escape, I remember taking a load of psychedelic mushrooms, thinking that it would help me escape. But I found myself that night at a club. I found myself downtown with a bunch of people that I just didn't want to be with, which is incidentally where detox came from. And I remember at the end of that night being not only high, but very sober at the same time, and being able to recognize that the hallucinogenic qualities of these drugs, of these escape mechanisms, were so surface that ultimately underneath all that was the awareness of what needed to be done. And what needs to be done is to unfuck myself. And Bastard, not one of my better days, is the beginning of that. At that point, I remember thinking about, the awkward teen that I was, and the character that I was trying to portray during the Steve Vai project for the sake of trying to win the approval of others, or I would just be the crazy kid to get attention to myself. There's this real sense of humiliation in a way. To all the hopeful ones, no one gives a fuck what you've got. And at the end, the girl from Blue City, I think another form of escape for me at that point was I became very interested in manga comics, Japanese sci-fi comics, and typically the ones that I enjoyed, The Dirty Pair, Ghost in the Shell, they all had these hyper exaggerated, like warrior women that were very strong, yet at the same time very sensitive. And it was, very sexual, of course, at the same time. And there was a sense within myself at the end of that night, just being high and depressed and in this horrible situation. And I found myself in this terrible part of the city, and I couldn't find my way home. And, it was just one of those nights. If you haven't experienced those sorts of nights, then, maybe you're fortunate. And if you have, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And so that leads into the death of music. So I think along the lines of this sense of the musical output that I have ultimately representing this trajectory from being an entity that, although sensitive, is not able to understand what it is that those emotional compulsions within him is trying to say, to becoming someone who is hopefully going to be able to actualize their true nature. There is the awareness that each one of these things in one's life that has been a convenient escape, be it drugs, sex, fear, alcohol, religion, politics, music, art, family, anything, really. There's the awareness that if it is taken to the point where you adhere all your sense of self-worth to that in absence of that, say there's a realization or a revelation that challenges that ideology, whatever that is, then you are left with an absence of self that is shattering. It's that ego. And the death of music represents, I think, in hindsight, the idea of an ego death. The idea that if my entire nature, if my entire personality is so invested in that what I do, that what I believe, if my entire sense of self-worth is dedicated to the people in my life that care for me, or the fact that I have an audience, or any number of things, I think you understand what I'm trying to say, that in absence of that, well, who are you? And the death of music was about my recognition that music for me plays a role in that actualization rather than being the role itself. I think that there is a very romantic notion among artists of being the type of creator that is just single-minded of purpose, where, you know, the Van Gogh or the Frank Zappa or the Beethoven, who their entire world is dedicated to that which they do. And do I feel that that is the wrong way to live? Well, I don't know. I don't know. And I'm not one to judge another person. However, in my own world, what I have found during this period is that music was a tool for me rather than my objective. It was the process that was important to me rather than the outcome. And the death of music was the realization of that. And it's amazing how, in hindsight, the idea of the lyric, it's like a death becomes musical. It's how the death of a friend, you know, through the murder of my friend, how the death of a connection to a certain fantasy, how the death of the connection to a certain stimulant, whatever, becomes ultimately grist for the mill. It becomes fuel for your own actualization. And when I say actualization, I am specifically meaning the ability to see yourself as yourself. And not only that, but to learn to love that and not to resent it. And so ultimately, the last song, Thing Beyond Things, represents being okay with that. It represents an acceptance that although this was difficult, although this is now something that you didn't expect, and although your life is now in a different place than you had anticipated, it's okay, because it's just things. It's just stuff. And the idea that Thing Beyond Things was the original recording from when I was a teen that I had originally not intended to put on this record almost summarized that transcendence in the best way possible. And I remember when they told me at that time that records have a maximum amount of 74 minutes. 74 minutes was all the time you could put on a record or a CD at that point. The total running time of Ocean Machine was 73 minutes and 53 seconds. I tried to make that as close to 74 minutes as I could with the technology that I had at the time. So I ended it with that scream. And that scream, which at the time people are saying, you know, I really get into this record, and then by the end you scream and it just like scares the shit out of me. The idea with that scream was just a primal, like, holy fuck, what the fuck has happened? And it's a cathartic release. And I think that if I was to define Ocean Machine as a project in any terms, a cathartic release is exactly how I would describe it. So anyway, that was Ocean Machine. I started with this album because I felt like, although Heavy is a Really Heavy Thing and Punky Brewster came before it, they weren't really the first releases for me. They were more curiosities. And I will go through each record, and I figure the best way for me to start this podcast, so to speak, is to go through the records, and who knows, by the end of it, I may end up becoming interested in doing a podcast and continue to do it. But if it's anything like most of these little spurts of energy that I have, you know, Gear Horror or Ziltoid or any of these things, I hit a point where all of a sudden I'm like, well, I think what I needed to achieve with that and what I needed to do with that format in order to progress artistically for myself, I have achieved, and then I just move on. I mean, that's very likely to happen with this podcast, but who knows? Maybe it won't. Maybe I'll be talking to you in 10 years and DEVIN TOWNSEND podcast will be endorsed by Pampers or something. Who knows? I think this first one, you have to break the crust, and so I'm happy to have done it. And I think the next record that I will deal with is Terria. Although there were albums in between, I'll get to all of them, but I'm going to deal with Terria next just because that's what I feel like. And my work functions best when I follow my compulsions rather than rules. So anyway, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you are hanging in there. I recognize the propensity that moments like this have for depression. I feel it myself. And if there's anything that I can encourage you to pursue to help deal with that, is a daily routine. And I know it may seem like, what difference does it make to establish a routine? But at one point, when I was in a facility for mental health, which I will deal with when we get to the Infinity record, one of the things that really helped me to straighten out those wires during that period was a daily routine. So during this quarantine, I set my alarm for 9 a.m. I get up, I do the meditation, I eat, I come outside and I work until 5, and then I exercise, and then I spend family time, and then I come back and set up my next day. And I do that until the weekend. On the weekend, I can sleep in a little more, and I take the weekend off from exercising. I don't take it off from meditation, but I take it off from exercising. And just maintaining those basic schedules allows me personally to contend with this looming sense of what the fuck is happening in the world in ways that I can wholeheartedly recommend. So if you're dealing with that, maybe consider trying to incorporate some sort of basic routine into your world and see if it doesn't help. My friends, I can't thank you enough for the support. Please try to continue fighting the good fight in your mind during this period. I'd like to thank Northern Music. I'd like to thank Inside Out Records. I'd like to thank every one of you who has supported my work for all these years. And I will see you on Twitch. I'll see you on Twitter, YouTube, and let's continue to do this. And I will do Terria next. Thank you very much, and have a good day. Dev out.